With the White House now asserting that they will block all White House current and former personnel from responding to any congressional subpoenas, with the White House amping up its criticism of former White House counsel Don McGahn for his very effective testimony to the Mueller investigation, particularly about the president's alleged obstruction of justice, with a specific pledge from the Trump White House now that they will try to keep Don McGahn from testifying to Congress, despite the fact that he has already been subpoenaed to testify. There are now today warnings about the behavior of the president and the Trump White House here that are coming from some interesting and unexpected quarters. Quoting from Politico.com today, quote, "This is risky," says William Jeffress, a prominent Washington defense attorney. Jeffress continues, quote, "I find it surprising because the president is taking these shots at witnesses who gave information to Mueller. I think he has got to be careful because there is an explicit federal statute punishing retaliation against witnesses." This is risky, what the president is doing, particularly with Don McGahn. You know, it's one thing if you are the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, you know, you're Congressman Elijah Cummings, or chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler, and you're out making this kind of argument about how the president is behaving and trying to block witnesses from coming before their committees, how the president might even be in trouble for behaving that way toward potential witnesses before those committees. You might expect that from those players in this drama, right? You would not necessarily expect it from one of President Richard Nixon's lawyers. But that is who William Jeffress is. And that makes it all the more interesting that he's issuing this warning today for the behavior of this president and this White House today. Joining us now is William Jeffress. He's a lawyer who represented President Nixon after he left office. Mr. Jeffress, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's great to have you here.
Good evening, Rachel.
In what sense do you mean that the president's behavior right now might be risky, might be legally risky?
Well, through his tweets, if nothing else, President Trump has made it clear that he's furious at a number of people, certainly including Don McGahn, including Michael Cohen, likely including others, who provided information to Mr. Mueller. And that information made its way into the report and was embarrassing to President Trump. Now, there is a criminal statute on the books. It's called Retaliation Against Witnesses. It punishes anybody who takes action to retaliate against a witness who has provided truthful information to law enforcement authorities. And President Trump and his lawyers have got to be very cautious in taking any action other than words against any of these people who he is angry at.
In terms of when you just said there, other than words, would the kind of criticism that the president has levied already against people who have testified potentially be shaky ground, given the possibility of intimidation of witnesses being invoked here as a relevant statute? Would it have to be some sort of act of furtherance to try to cause harm to those persons? Obviously, we have seen at least one act taken by the White House in that they have fired Don McGahn's law firm, with some White House anonymous sources telling reporters that that was taken specifically in response to Don McGahn essentially becoming an enemy of the White House based on his testimony.
The way the statute reads is, if the president causes any harm to an individual in retaliation for his testimony, that's a criminal offense carrying a prison sentence of up to 10 years. And yes, I think if you caused the firing of a law firm that caused harm to the witness, and you did that specifically with intent to retaliate against the witness's testimony, that would unquestionably be a crime.
Mr. Jeffress, there's an interesting question that is arising now about whether or not the White House can block former White House counsel Don McGahn from testifying. They have expressed that they want to assert executive privilege here. Obviously, this is something that was a very interesting point of contention in the Watergate conflict. A lot of people have said that because Don McGahn testified to the special counsel's office, because his testimony to the special counsel's office was in fact made public in the redacted version of the report that was released publicly, that doesn't give the White House a very strong leg to stand on in terms of claiming that those things that he testified about are covered by privilege and can't be conveyed to Congress. What do you think of that debate?
Well, I agree with the point you just made, the fact that the executive privilege is designed to protect the confidentiality of communications between the president and his staff or between other government officials regarding government policy. None of this is confidential anymore. Don McGahn talked freely to the special counsel. That testimony has been made public. And so long as the Congress confines its questions to Mr. McGahn to the subjects on which he talked to Mr. Mueller, I don't think they have a leg to stand on. But there's another reason. The other reason is Don McGahn's not a government employee. The government doesn't have the right to demand that he keep his mouth shut. This is not attorney-client privilege where McGahn is bound by law or by ethics to keep his mouth shut about communications with the president. He's a former employee. If the White House had the right to instruct former employees not to talk about their conversations with the president, we'd certainly have a lot fewer tell-all books by former White House staffers.
William Jeffress, attorney who represented former President Richard Nixon after he left office. Sir, thank you for helping us understand your perspective on this. I hope you'll come back. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Much more ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.